She told me I shouldn't be here, then closed the distance between us, and everything changed. The afternoon sunlight was soft, filtering through the leafy canopy that lined the quiet street. I was walking home from work, headphones tucked in my pocket, enjoying the rare calm of a late spring day. That's when I noticed her, my neighbor, though I hadn't seen her much before. She was in her garden, crouched among a patch of blooming flowers, her hands lightly pressing soil around a young rosebush. There was a quiet grace in the way she moved, a precision that suggested both confidence and care. She looked up as I passed the fence. Her eyes, sharp yet curious, met mine, and for a brief moment, the world outside that garden seemed to fade. She was around 42, impeccably put together, though the elegance she carried didn't rely on fashion alone. It was in the gentle poise of her posture, the ease with which she held herself. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried authority. "You shouldn't be here," she said, and my heart stumbled at the words. There was no anger in her tone, only a quiet, almost teasing caution, like she was challenging me to see if I understood boundaries, or perhaps, if I would respect hers. I froze, a little taken aback by the sudden attention. Part of me wanted to apologize and retreat, but another, more curious part, wanted to linger. I noticed details that made my chest tighten with a mixture of admiration and intrigue. The faint scent of jasmine from her garden mingled with the warm earth, the soft brush of sunlight across her hair that highlighted subtle streaks of silver, and the slight upward tilt of her lips that suggested amusement at my hesitation. She straightened up, adjusting the wide brim of her straw hat, and that small motion drew my eyes to the gentle curve of her neck and the grace of her shoulders. Even in this brief encounter, she radiated a quiet strength that contrasted with an almost imperceptible vulnerability. Something in the way her fingers lingered over the flowers suggested a tenderness I hadn't expected. I cleared my throat, attempting to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I offered a small, awkward smile, which she returned with a subtle nod, just enough to acknowledge me without inviting too much closeness. Yet, despite the distance she maintained, there was something magnetic about her presence. I could feel the pull of curiosity, the desire to understand her, to cross that invisible boundary she had so delicately drawn. As I walked away, I kept stealing glances back, feeling an unexpected flutter in my chest. The encounter lingered in my mind like the scent of her garden, soft, lingering, impossible to ignore. I knew, even then, that this brief meeting had planted the seed of something more. Something that would slowly grow between us, in its own time, like the roses she so carefully tended. A few days later, I found myself passing her garden again, this time with a little more anticipation than I cared to admit. I wasn't sure why the thought of her presence made my pulse quicken, but it did. Perhaps it was the way she seemed to command the space around her, or the quiet elegance that made ordinary moments feel charged. That afternoon, a sudden noise, a rustling bag near the fence, startled me. My foot caught on the uneven pavement, and I stumbled slightly. Before I could regain my balance, a hand landed lightly on my arm. It was hers. The touch was soft but firm enough to steady me. I froze, surprised not only by the sudden contact but also by the warmth radiating from her skin. My heart thudded in my chest, an echo of the silent electricity between us. She held my arm just long enough to ensure I was steady, then gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Careful," she whispered, her voice low, a hint of amusement threading through the caution. Her fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary, and I became acutely aware of every detail: the smoothness of her skin, the faint warmth from her touch, and the subtle scent of her perfume, earthy, floral, and somehow grounding. I realized I was leaning in slightly, drawn by the intimacy of the gesture, and she didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes met mine, steady and knowing, and for a heartbeat, everything else, the street, the cars, even my own thoughts, faded into the background. "You weren't expecting me to be nearby," she said softly, with a teasing lift at the edge of her lips. Her gaze lingered on me, observing my reaction, gauging my hesitation. I felt a mix of nervousness and an unspoken thrill, as if we were both silently acknowledging a boundary being tested, without needing words to define it. Then, almost imperceptibly, she guided me a step closer to the garden path, her hand moving from my arm to lightly rest near my elbow. The gesture was casual, yet the closeness made my chest tighten. I noticed the gentle sway of her hair as she adjusted herself to walk beside me, brushing the side of my shoulder with a feather-light touch. My senses seemed to sharpen, the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze, the soft thud of our synchronized steps, the warmth that radiated from her as she moved just a fraction closer. I wanted to speak, to explain why I kept staring at her, but my words felt inadequate. Instead, I simply let myself be guided, aware of the quiet intimacy forming in the space between us. Her presence was magnetic yet comforting, a paradox that left me simultaneously cautious and daring. In that brief, ordinary moment, I realized something profound. The simplest touch could carry a world of meaning, and this connection, so fleeting yet so intense, was only the beginning. As we parted a few moments later, she offered a glance over her shoulder, her smile soft, teasing, and warm. My chest still fluttered, and I knew I would replay that fleeting contact over and over in my mind. In the days that followed, our encounters became almost accidental, but never quite. There was a rhythm to them, subtle and unspoken, as if the universe itself conspired to bring us together in fleeting, private moments. I might see her at the mailbox, her hands full of letters, or catch a glimpse of her from the hallway window, adjusting a vase or glancing outside with quiet curiosity. Each encounter left me more aware of her presence, more attuned to the nuances of her gestures, and strangely eager for these small intersections of our lives. One afternoon, I found her leaning over the railing of her balcony, arranging a pot of freshly sprouted daisies. I called a soft greeting, half expecting her to shoo me away, but instead, she smiled warmly, her eyes crinkling at the corners, a sparkle of amusement dancing within them. "I thought this spot could use some brightness," she said, offering me one of the smaller blooms as if it were a personal invitation rather than a casual gesture. My fingers brushed hers as I took it, and the warmth from her touch lingered, sending an unexpected shiver down my spine. The more I observed her, the more I noticed subtle cues in her behavior. The tilt of her head when she listened to me speak, the way her eyebrows would lift slightly in gentle curiosity, and the quiet laugh that came when something amused her. Each detail drew me in, making ordinary moments feel profound. I began to wonder, were these gestures accidental, or was there an intentionality behind them? The uncertainty made my chest ache in a delicious way, a mixture of anticipation and the subtle tension of unspoken attraction. She also started leaving little signs of thoughtfulness. A book I mentioned in passing one evening appeared on my doorstep a few days later, its pages marked with tiny notes in her neat handwriting. Once, a small flower from her garden lay tucked into my mailbox, the petals soft and fragrant, the scent of jasmine and fresh earth lingering long after I held it. These gestures weren't romantic in the traditional sense. They were delicate, nuanced expressions of connection, yet they resonated deeply, stirring a longing I had not anticipated. The physicality of our interactions remained minimal but deliberate. A hand brushed against mine as she handed me a note, her fingers warm and lingering slightly, creating an electric awareness of her nearness. Her presence was magnetic, and even casual proximity, standing on the same porch, leaning slightly as she adjusted a windowpane, felt intimate. I found myself acutely aware of the space between us, measuring every gesture, every pause, every glance for hidden meaning. Internally, I wrestled with the questions that these encounters stirred. Was this merely friendship, or something more profound? Could a 24-year-old like me ever bridge the gap between admiration and desire, between youthful curiosity and mature, experienced allure? And yet, even as these thoughts tangled in my mind, I felt drawn to her more than ever, knowing that this slow, careful connection, the teasing, the small gestures, the quiet attention, was only the beginning of something that could grow, if I allowed myself to lean into it. A week later, she invited me inside under a casual pretext, something about helping her rearrange books in the living room. My chest tightened as I stepped past the threshold of her home. The air inside smelled faintly of vanilla and old wood, comforting yet intimate, as if the house itself carried her warmth. Sunlight streamed in through the wide windows, catching dust motes that danced lazily around her, illuminating the gentle curve of her smile and the quiet grace in her movements. We sat close on the couch, arranging books on the low table in front of us. The space between us was narrow enough that I could feel the faint warmth radiating from her body, the subtle pressure of her shoulder occasionally brushing against mine. She began to speak, her voice soft and unhurried, telling a story about a recent heartbreak she had endured. Her hands moved expressively, but never carelessly, resting sometimes on her lap or lightly on the edge of the table, emphasizing the cadence of her words. As she shared, I noticed the vulnerability beneath her confident exterior, the slight tremor in her voice, the tight grip on the throw pillow when she mentioned the hardest parts. I listened intently, not just to her words, but to the subtle cues of emotion she couldn't fully mask. Every so often, she would pause, glance at me, and offer a faint smile that seemed to say, "I trust you enough to let you in, but don't misstep." I realized then that the intimacy in this moment was less about physical closeness and more about the courage it took to expose her heart to someone younger, someone still learning about the world. At a natural pause in her story, she reached out almost impulsively, her hand resting on my knee, for balance, as I leaned slightly to reach a book across the table. The gesture was casual on the surface, yet underneath it was a gentle assertion of closeness, a physical punctuation to the emotional connection we were weaving. Her fingers were warm and soft, the subtle pressure grounding me, making me painfully aware of the charged quiet between us. The air seemed to thicken around us. My own nervous energy was palpable. I could feel it in my palms, the slight tremor in my fingers as I held the book. And yet, there was comfort in her touch, a steady reassurance that this space, this moment, was safe. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. The quiet intimacy of sitting near each other, hands occasionally brushing, breaths mingling in the gentle sunlight, said everything words could not. When our eyes met, there was an unspoken acknowledgement. This was a delicate boundary, a bridge between mentorship and something more. My heart thumped with awareness of her nearness, and I realized that these small, seemingly ordinary gestures, resting a hand on a knee, leaning in slightly, sharing a story, had become monumental acts in the slow unfolding of our connection. For the first time, I felt that the pull between us was no longer just curiosity. It was the beginning of something deeper, something neither of us needed to name just yet. Over the next few days, I found myself replaying every interaction with her in my mind. Each small gesture, the brush of her fingers as she handed me a note, the way her eyes lingered when she laughed, the gentle tilt of her head as she listened, left me both exhilarated and anxious. I couldn't stop thinking about her, and yet I wrestled with the reality of our situation, the age gap, the difference in life experience, the societal expectations that whispered caution. She noticed my hesitation, though she never pressed. Instead, she allowed our proximity to speak. A casual touch here, a hand lightly brushing against my shoulder as we passed in the hallway, the subtle warmth of her fingers resting against mine as she handed me a book, all these moments felt deliberate, yet soft enough that I could convince myself they were accidental. And each time, my awareness of her nearness sent a rush of emotion through me that was difficult to name. Walking together one afternoon, she shifted her bag slightly and my arm brushed hers. My heart jumped, and I caught a fleeting glance from her. Her eyes sparkled, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that hummed between us. It was as if she were daring me, gently testing the boundaries while letting me explore my own feelings. The closeness was intoxicating, the shared space almost magnetic. I felt the warmth of her body as she adjusted her stride to match mine, and the faint fragrance she carried, a mix of jasmine and sun-warmed linen, made it impossible not to notice her. Inside, my thoughts were a tangled web of admiration, desire, and caution. Could I let myself feel something deeper? Did she truly sense the pull between us, or was I imagining it? I kept returning to the small, seemingly insignificant gestures, the way she would brush a strand of hair behind her ear while speaking to me, the way her hand lingered on mine when handing over an item, the subtle, lingering glances that followed me even as I turned away. Each moment made the desire more tangible, yet the hesitation remained, rooted in respect and the fear of overstepping. Despite the internal conflict, I realized that the tension between us was no longer one-sided. She was testing, guiding, inviting in ways that felt natural and effortless. Her touches were never invasive, they were measured, thoughtful, and deeply human, conveying warmth, reassurance, and a quiet intimacy that words alone could not capture. I began to understand that attraction was not always dramatic or overt. Sometimes it was the gentle brush of fingers, the warmth shared in a casual walk, the electricity of a smile that lasted a beat too long. By the end of the day, as we parted, her hand lingered briefly against mine, a soft, unspoken promise. My chest felt tight, my mind whirring with conflicting emotions, yet underneath it all was a growing certainty. I wanted to explore this connection, slowly, carefully, and with all the respect and attention it deserved. The tension between caution and desire had become the quiet heartbeat of our relationship, a rhythm I was increasingly unwilling to ignore. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world outside seemed to pause. Rain pattered gently against the windows, a soft rhythm that filled the room with a sense of calm. We had ended up in her living room, the dim light casting warm shadows across the furniture. She was seated on the couch, and I was across from her, our conversation having drifted from casual topics to more personal stories. There was a sense of quiet intimacy, of a shared world existing only between us, insulated from the outside. Her gaze lingered on me longer than usual, calm and steady, and I felt a twinge of anticipation ripple through me. There was no urgency in her movements, no rush to close the distance, but the subtle invitation was there. I noticed how her fingers traced the edge of the cushion, how her shoulder leaned slightly toward me, as if the space between us was meant to shrink. Every small gesture carried weight, every pause in conversation charged with the unspoken understanding that something significant was about to happen. Then, almost impulsively, she reached out. Her hand brushed against my arm, and instead of withdrawing, she guided me gently closer, until the side of her cheek rested near my shoulder. My breath caught at the sensation, the warmth of her skin, the softness of her hair brushing lightly against mine, the steady rhythm of her breathing that seemed to sync with my own. It was intimate, yet entirely safe, a closeness that spoke of trust, comfort, and a shared vulnerability either of us needed to name. The moment stretched, suspended in a delicate balance of awareness and restraint. I could feel the heat radiating from her, the faint fragrance of her perfume mingling with the earthy scent of the rain-soaked room. Her fingers remained lightly on my arm, subtle pressure that grounded both of us. I noticed the slight tremor in my own hands, the way my heart had picked up a nervous, excited rhythm. There was a magnetic pull in the quiet, a gentle tension that neither words nor actions could fully capture. Her presence was overwhelming in the most understated way, calm yet electric, tender yet commanding attention. For a long moment, there was nothing but the closeness of our bodies, the quiet murmur of rain, and the shared awareness that something unspoken had shifted. The emotional intensity was almost tangible. It hovered in the air like a secret we both understood but hadn't yet articulated. Finally, we pulled back slightly, though neither of us moved completely apart. Her eyes met mine, warm and steady, conveying something profound without a single word. That brief, deliberate closeness, her cheek against my shoulder, her hand lightly resting on my arm, had changed everything. It wasn't a confession or a declaration. It was something subtler and more powerful, the undeniable recognition of attraction, the quiet acknowledgement that our connection had deepened into something neither of us could ignore. As the rain continued to fall outside, I realized that this moment, fleeting and delicate, was the culmination of days of small touches, lingering glances, and subtle intimacy. The slow burn had reached its peak, and the tension between us now carried a sense of promise, a gentle, unspoken understanding that we were both ready to explore what had quietly grown between us. The following morning, sunlight streamed softly through the curtains, illuminating her living room in golden hues. The rain from the night before had left the world outside glistening and fresh, the faint scent of damp earth drifting in through the open window. She and I sat together on the couch, a quiet cup of tea cradled in each of our hands. The space between us was smaller than usual, the warmth of her presence lingering like an invisible thread binding us. There was no rush, no grand gesture, just the comfortable intimacy that had grown slowly over days of stolen glances, casual touches, and shared confidences. Her hand hovered near mine, fingers brushing lightly against mine as we both reached for our cups. Each contact was deliberate in its subtlety, a soft spark of connection that neither demanded acknowledgement nor denied its significance. I could feel the warmth radiating from her palm, steady and grounding, and it mirrored the fluttering anticipation I carried in my chest. We spoke in low, easy tones, sharing stories of our week, but the conversation felt secondary to the quiet communion we had built. Our eyes met frequently, holding each other's gaze just a beat longer than necessary, allowing the unspoken tension of our feelings to exist comfortably between us. There was laughter, gentle and unforced, and moments of silence that felt full and complete. Every gesture, from the tilt of her head to the gentle shift of her shoulder closer to mine, reinforced the connection we had nurtured so carefully. At one point, I shifted slightly, and her hand lightly pressed against mine, not in urgency, but in reassurance, a silent acknowledgement of what had developed between us. The warmth of her touch, the subtle pressure of her fingers interlacing with mine, made the room feel smaller, more intimate. My pulse quickened, yet there was no anxiety, only the deep comfort of being understood and accepted. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully relax into the feeling of being near her, aware of how natural and effortless this closeness had become. She smiled, and I noticed the faint crinkle at the corners of her eyes, a softness in her expression that mirrored the gentle rhythm of the rain-soaked evening before. It was a smile that carried both warmth and a quiet sense of invitation, a promise that the connection we had built was mutual, respectful, and enduring. We lingered together, fingers occasionally brushing, the subtle contact carrying more meaning than words ever could. The tension that had built over days of careful observation, tentative touches, and shared moments of vulnerability had transformed into a gentle certainty. There was no rush, no need for grand declarations, just the quiet understanding that we were drawn to each other in ways that transcended age, circumstance, or expectation. As the morning light bathed the room in warmth, I realized that the slow-burn connection we had cultivated had reached a place of quiet fulfillment. The attraction, the trust, the intimacy, it all existed in small gestures, shared spaces, and lingering touches. And in that moment, sitting close, hands brushing, hearts quietly attuned to each other, I understood that this was more than curiosity or fleeting desire. This was the beginning of something lasting, tender, and profoundly human, a connection that would continue to grow, slowly, deliberately, and beautifully.